We're recording. So we have Michelle Allen, who is an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, director of the Program in Health Disparities Research, and endowed chair of Health Equity Research at the University of Minnesota Medical School. And where she also co-directs the Community Engagement Collaboration Core of the UMN Clinical Translational Science. And her research focuses on community-based participatory approaches to developing and implementing health promotion and tobacco and other substance use prevention interventions for adolescents of color and those from immigrant communities. She's a leader in the science of participatory research and increasing capacity on both academic and community sides of research for collaboration. And Dr. Allen is here with Dr. Brooke Cunningham, who's a general internist, a sociologist, and assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at University of Minnesota Medical School. And she's done a lot of really excellent training in internal medicine, and also did a sounds really interesting, a fellowship in bioethics in health. And her work aims to increase physicians' abilities to address racism as a fundamental cause of disease. And she uses mixed methods to examine factors that impede or facilitate health systems' efforts to address health equity, such as colorblindness, implicit bias, and conceptualizing race as a biological variable. And Dr. Cunningham has an NHLBI funded K-23 Career Development Award to develop and test a method for healthcare providers to communicate about racism with their African-American patients. And they are joined by one of their partners, Luis Ortega, who is a lifelong public school educator and administrator of an advocate for educational equity. He's a founding member of the Somali Latino Hmong Partnership for Health and Wellness. SOLAMO is a multi-ethnic community-driven research program that uses participatory research to build upon the unique cultural strengths of historically marginalized communities to promote health and wellness. So he's a community co-PI with Dr. Allen on an NIMHD funded project trust. And so we're really excited to have this team talk with us today. I'm really interested in the methods you're using. I think, the group here, we do a lot of work in thinking about how to integrate health equity into implementation science, frameworks, theories, and models. So we're excited to hear about your work and how you've done that.
All right, thank you. So let me see, thank you for going through our long bios. Let me see if I can share my screen here, and then I'm gonna have you tell me whether I am, let me see, presenting the slideshow. Okay, so you're seeing the slides and not my note page, correct?
I don't see the slides.
Not seeing the slides.
All right, let me try this one instead. How about that?
No.
Oh,
there
no.
you go.
Okay.
All right.
Human subjects is what I see.
We're seeing your notes, like a document.
Okay.
Two versions of the document. You may need to stop sharing and reach. There you
There
go.
we go.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Let me see though. I think. All right. Are you all right, so we'll just
We
go
see the notes as well, Michelle. I don't know if you want to hit from the beginning.
Maybe in presenter view.
Yeah. How's that?
Well, we see your presentation, maybe slideshow, is that?
Okay, let me try this once more.
Yep.
Here we go.
All right.
Got it.
Okay, too many things pulled up. All right, so we want to start out real quickly with acknowledge our other team members. So the work that we're presenting today comes out of Project Trust, which we mentioned earlier. So Shannon Pergament, Nicole Bates, and April Wilhelm were all part of this team. And April Wilhelm in particular led our CFR analysis, and she wasn't able to be with us today. So in 15 minutes, we're going to try to present, or at least introduce, our complex intervention and talk about 2 iterations of CFR analyses. So we'll see how we do. And so we're starting with some assumptions that I think are fair, that you all are quite familiar with CFR and have a general fluency about health equity and health equity interventions. So our objective today is to tell you a bit about how we adapted and applied CFR based on a racism conscious frame to understand the ways that structural racism interacted with intervention, implementation, and uptake within an equity-oriented trial that was focused on student school connectedness, and that's Project Trust. So Project Trust stands for Training for Resiliency in Urban Students and Teachers. It's a 5-year school-based participatory research trial that we implemented across 10 schools. The aim was to bring youth and parent voices into school decision-making. And by doing this, to try to transform school environments in a way that would increase connectedness to school for Black, Indigenous, and students of color in particular, with the ultimate goals of improving their academic and health outcomes. So we really were approaching school connectedness as a key social determinant of adolescent health. So Project Trust has 3 main intervention components shown here on the left. So youth participatory action research and parent participatory action research, and a positive youth development focused teacher professional development series. So for the YPAR and PPAR components, the parent and youth researchers conducted research and then made recommendations for improving their school environments. And leaders at the participating schools agreed to implement the 3 of the 5 priorities that came out of youth and parent research, the recommendations that they generated, and also to implement the teacher professional development components. So as I mentioned, we did 2 rounds of CFR analysis. So I'm going to really briefly describe the sort of standard CFR analysis that we did as part of implementing our first wave of schools. So we wanted to identify and compare barriers and facilitators influencing implementation, using qualitative data collected during Trust's implementation phase. So 2 Trust members, April and another team member, who are not involved in implementing the interventions in the schools, collected data from 6 community academic researchers and 4 school administrators involved in Trust implementation. And you can see the type of qualitative data that was gathered here. And then we used, based on Dan Schroeder's approach, 2013, we kind of went through these 5 steps that I'm not going to go through in detail. We can come back to that in the discussion if you'd like to, but really, you know, kind of a standard use of CFR, with the exception of the fact that we did sort of tweak the domains and construct definitions to align with our participatory trial. Otherwise, we went through a content analysis, developed a summary memos for 5 schools, and using kind of a process amongst our collaborators. We pooled the scores were pooled to create an overall implementation effectiveness score for each school, which we used to divide the schools into low, intermediate, and high implementation. And then once all the construct ratings were assigned, the team compared ratings for each construct between low and high implementation schools to identify potential relationships between the constructs and trust implementation. And so this is a visual representation of this first pass of outcomes, with the red stars indicating highly distinguishing constructs and the yellow stars indicating weakly distinguishing constructs. And so most distinguishing constructs fell within the inner and outer setting domains that really encompassed the broader economic, political, and social context within each school building. And then from this, so again, these 10 of 30 constructs were really, you know, distinguishing. And then we sort of looked at a couple of broad themes that came out of the content analysis. And they really highlighted the importance of strong leadership engagement and a high degree of alignment between the intervention and institutional programs and systems to the success of the implementation. And within our team, as we were talking about leadership engagement and talking about the alignment and how that played out in each of the schools, we really recognized that, you know, there were some equity components to this, some ways that we were seeing racism, that we were seeing some concerns, some things that we had noticed and that we were talking about within our team around thinking about which leaders were engaging and which weren't in the intervention. And so that really led us to wanting to do a more racism conscious analysis than what we are allowed to do with a standard CFR approach. And this was really based, I think, for us on this idea of moving into this 4th generation of health equity research. So really wanting to take action that considers race praxis and social determinants of health, and that also really aligns, includes community voice as we are conceptualizing our interventions and why our interventions work or don't work. And at that point, we reached out to Brooke to work with us to think about this critical race, public health critical race praxis approach, which she's used in some of her work to think more deeply about that intersection between implementation and racism.
Thank you, Michelle. It looks like I'm off mute. Could you forward to your next slide and back so I can just orient? There you go. So clearly this audience knows CFR. And to some extent from even the introduction, some concern with health equity and background in health equity research. What the fourth generation advances health equity research by really grounding us in racism as a fundamental cause of disease, right? And so does public health critical race praxis. Those things overlap. So Dr. Stephen Thomas, who was on the previous slide, and then the authors of the article at the bottom of this slide, Chandra Ford and Collins Arhihinbua, sort of basically move forward. And critical race theory is both complex and simple. And the simple piece is that an acceptance that racism is operative in our everyday lives and within our organizations. That's core. And some pieces of it also really focus on, and I would lift up this article, and this article is really a model for the work that we did here, because in this article, what they really talk about is how we do like conventional science and how that changes when we apply a public health critical race praxis lens. And so there are 4 domains that they talk about in their article. There are 10 sort of subdomains, and these are some that were really important to us, right? Like race is a social construct, it's not biological, that presumptions of race neutrality, and I want to read a quote from our article, Uphold the Status Quo. And so let me read that quote first. So this can be found on the 2nd page of our article that basically says, CFAR's deployment as a presumptively race-neutral tool may obscure the influences of race-related factors on the intervention implementation process, which may limit understandings of barriers and facilitators specific to interventions addressing health disparities. Critical race theory suggests that when consideration of race is not at the forefront of analysis, our ability to identify social factors that determine study outcomes is limited. And so we have to move away from race neutrality to deliberate race consciousness and dig beneath the surface, which means think really deeply about the ways that perhaps participants recognizing your data, but perhaps unstated ways in which power around race is operating within the data, and consider the positionality of people on the team. Michelle, next slide, please. So in our racism conscious analysis, one, we recognize the importance of voice. And Louise is here to talk about our community academic team and some aspects of the study, as well as the background of the school system. And voice is particularly important, and voices that are counter or may challenge or may have a different perspective from the dominant ways in which sort of people in academia see the world and understand and interpret data. We look particularly at those constructs that we hypothesize to be particularly sensitive to racialized facilitators and barriers. We refined our presumptions, which really focused on, again, racism consciousness, knowledge production, right? Recognizing that CFAR's race neutrality needed to be perhaps challenged. And that also included a critical disciplinary self-critique, as well as other voices. And then we used the public health critical race praxis questions to guide analysis. And then we recoded and looked back at our data with those orienting questions in mind. Michelle, next slide, please. And some of the things that we found, and I'll let Michelle really dig back into this, but whereas that, across the schools, there was variation in the understanding of race inequities. And some people had a shared language, often developed by participating in some activities that were sort of in the outer setting, involved with the district. Leadership willingness to go there, right, to think about race, to embrace Project Trust as sort of altering dynamics between BIPOC students and the school was related to the race and ethnicity of leaders, was related to how teachers, students, parents in particular, were connected to community and community support. And again, we highlight that again in the culture communication and facilitating connections. Leadership, again, readiness for change in the status quo and whether they welcomed that or resisted that. Perception of influence of champions was racialized. And then again, I mentioned the school district and the sort of external outer setting as particularly important. Michelle, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I would, if I can go off mute. So I think that, you know, some of the constructs rose up in a similar level of influence than that they had in our initial analysis. But I think there are others that became more important when looking through this frame. And then probably more importantly is that we understood some of the nuances and why things were playing out the way that they were, that we really weren't able to see through our initial analysis. So just in conclusion, this racism conscious analysis, as I mentioned, uncovered new facilitators and barriers that if we hadn't been looking for those, we would have missed some of the important contributors to intervention uptake. And also in thinking about capacity preparation for doing and uptaking equity-oriented interventions, you know, I think a key finding that we walked away with is that institutions need to be prepared to have some of these hard conversations about race and racism, need to be prepared to be able to be conversant in how structural racism is playing out within in a way that they may not be aware of. And then finally, you know, particularly as a white researcher, I think that diversity in teams is an absolute necessity for this fourth generation of health disparities research. So both in terms of the voice of having community members on the team, but also the skills and expertise to be ready to do public health critical race praxis, critical race types of analyses, and then from the perspective of race, ethnicity, and experiences of the researchers themselves. We will wrap up our presentation there and move it to discussion at this point.
Thank you so much, Brooke and Michelle. That was, I think, it was really clear presentation in terms of helping us think about the methods, which is what I'm always really eager. I mean, I'm very eager for examples, and I think a lot of our methods working group are too, of how you actually, this process that you took of, you know, doing this first piece where you took the consolidated framework for implementation research and you set out, it sounds like, to learn about barriers and facilitators to the implementation of the intervention. And then during the discussions you have or the engagement you had with your community partners, and then just interpreting the data, you realized that there was another framework. It wasn't giving you enough of what you needed to see or what was emerging in the data during analysis. And then you went on to do this second level or next level or different analysis where you said, you know, you were starting, health equity considerations were starting to merge just in looking at the data and talking with your partners. But you also, what really struck me too, is you took an intentional approach to not just, you know, looking at what comes up around equity. You also went into that analysis with a framework. So an equity Sounds like you would call that a health equity framework, or it was called the critical role praxis. But you went into that analysis with another framework that you layered on or integrated with CFR, and then you recoded the data and it gave you some richer relevant data around the research questions you have. As a methods question, I wonder about, so you say you've adapted CFR, and I wondered about, did you, it's one thing to have health equity integrated and you're not adapting a framework or changing a framework. You take one of these existing implementation science framework and you do what you did. You bring in an equity lens, and that should be driven by a framework. But I'm curious, did you collaborate with Laura Damschroeder or the CFR team to kind of end up with some agreed upon adapted version of the CFR? Is this something you're trying to pursue? Or how do you look at, in terms of methods, how do you look at kind of the work you've done and its contribution and where it sits within implementation science as a new framework and so that's one piece of it. And then how do your, I'll just stop there. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, Brooke, feel free to chime in, but I think that, I think that we've done two things. I mean, one is we've, I think, shown the flexibility of CFR and the utility of CFR. I think that the basic sort of constructs of CFR still helped us understand some of the contributors in the to where our intervention got traction and where it didn't. So it wasn't perfect, but I still think that the CFR framework did give us a grounding. Where we had to, I don't think that I'm personally wouldn't say that I'm advocating for tossing CFR out, but I think that what we need to recognize, and this was, I think, the point that both Brooke and I were trying to make, is these tools that we presume to be racism neutral just don't get us there. And so asking different questions and then sort of approaching the analysis with this really and very explicit sort of framework and way of thinking about how racism plays out through public health critical race praxis allowed us to look within the CFR constructs in a different way, and then to also kind of interpret some broader themes in a different way. So I think that it's the intersection of the two that really is that really gives it power. I don't know, Brooke, would you agree? I think you're on mute.
So thank you. I was saying that I agreed. I think what the fourth generation of health equity research asks us to do, what critical race theory asks us to do, is really two things. One, it asks us to ask different questions than we would have initially started with. And so we had, and again, I came in as Michelle and the team were moving to this different phase, right? And so they had hypotheses for analyzing the data the first go round, but some things were emergent even from them being in the setting, right? And to understand variation and uptake, it was important because they could see it, and Michelle, again, correct me, and Louise, come in, correct, like how important sort of thinking through racism, racialization, racial interactions, racial dynamics, power, racialized power were important for intervention success. And so what happens in science is that we generally don't orient in that way. The second thing that happens is the other piece for sort of anti-racist change or anti-racist science is to, as we ask those questions, to also have others who are most directly impacted. So individuals for, right, disparities sensitive populations, right, who are on the ground, who are in the community, help us, right, and often bring us along to really understand what's going on. So the other part of sort of anti-racist science and practice is community input, right? Because in many ways, there are multiple aspects of our sort of professional socialization on the academic side that can make us less sensitive, sort of can dull our analytical skills, that community voices and being in the ground and being right there up close help, improve our science.
Yeah, those are really helpful. It's really helpful to have this insight too, and to hear how you approached it. Now, it's how you approach the analysis, and it sounds like the things you're telling us about too, you've learned a lot about maybe the next time you go into it, what Brooke is saying, the kind of upfront work that the lens you might take for an implementation evaluation from the beginning. And I want to ask one more question before everyone else does, and I don't know if we can ask Louise, but I'm really curious what how you did, if you could say a bit more about how you did engage your partners. So this is still, it's still pretty academic. We're talking about frameworks and we're doing analyses. And so how did you do that? Could you tell us a little more about the engagement part where you're like creating this safe, or this space where people could actually look at the data and feel like they could tell you maybe there's another way to interpret that, or a different way of looking at that, and how maybe you could share with us some of your strategy for engaging your partners in the analysis phase.
So yeah, Michelle says, Louis, you want to present? I said, I think I'm zoomed out. Zooming and me don't get along. I'd rather be there in front of people, feeling this out a little bit. So I am a little bit more boots on the ground kind of guy. So that's where we become a team, I guess, because they can do the modeling and the structural conversations. Kind of what Brooke said earlier, some of this, when we came into this project, we sort of didn't use the word racism, right? Because our lives and what we bring to the work is that we wanted to bring voice, what Brooke was mentioning, to individuals in these systems that don't tend to have that opportunity. So we didn't go to and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, we didn't go to the PTO right away. We didn't go to the student council. The work really started in the very beginning on how do we recruit folks who don't tend to be available to be recruited because, right? And we can have all the examples of what stops families from being involved in different school projects, or what students can't get involved in different school projects. So we started out with that very sort of basic premise of how do we bring those individuals who don't get told enough that their voice matters and that their voice won, and how do we then help them produce that voice through a process so that it can be heard by the powers that be. So really a lot of that was the premise of how we came into recruiting the participants in both the YPAR and the PPAR work. In the PD, which happened actually 2 years before all that. So this is really a 10-year project. If you talk about when Michelle and I first started talking about students and resiliency and voice, and how do we help staff understand that creating relationships and listening to students is important. When we educators all think we know how to do that well, we all really know that we don't do it that well for all kids, right? So it's just been a common thread in the conversation. I don't tend to break it down into as many categories as you guys want to break it down. Not that it's not helpful to kind of understand how complex the issue is.
That's terrific. Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. That was,
That's
that's great.
It's not that I can't talk. I just don't like Zoom anymore.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay, so maybe we'll open it up to if you could, be great if you could come on, if you have a question, come on video, raise your hand. We'll call you out and ask the team some questions. Oh, Jen Cruz has a question.
I do have a question. And so Brooke kind of mentioned this a bit about power. And I'm really curious, when you build these types of relationships and you're doing this work that's really integrated with community and you're uplifting these voices and bringing them into these spaces, are there processes that you've used or ways that you've thought about explicitly naming those power dynamics or bringing it into the room to kind of explore that further, especially as academia is in itself like a really racist system, and taking that and using it to explore racism with community partners, and just the whole project being about this? Was that something that was explicitly talked about across the group?
Lou, you can chime in here. So yes, and so in the kind of life course of Project Trust, that we was just sort of describing, we had lots of conversations, and being a community-based participatory research trial, you know, that was kind of an inherent part of the conversations in terms of the dynamics between the community research team and the academic research team. So yeah, that was part of it all along. I think that when we took on this analysis, I mean, the process of public health community race praxis kind of took it to another level, in terms of really thinking explicitly about racism. I think as we said, we talked about inequities, we talked about racism, but that wasn't the ultimate focus of Project Trust. And so it is kind of an interesting case study to see how this played out. But when we sort of took on that public health critical race praxis, we had a number of conversations really sort of talking about our positionality and power and our approach to this. So, creating spaces where you can have these conversations, I think, is a key part of community engaged work, as well as a racism conscious approach in research.
Garen has a question next.
Yeah, thanks so much for really, really interesting work. You're really going to help us move this field forward through this work. So I'm very grateful for that. It's a little bit builds on Jen's question, and that is, so you talked in your initial analysis about the importance of leadership engagement, which I think is really important. And Brooke commented that we need to approach all of the work we're doing asking, how does racism play here, which I think is exactly right. Those are going to bump up against each other sometimes. And if you're thinking about your next study, I'm not sure the extent to which you've focused on this in the current study, but like how do you bring those together? Because there are going to be many leaders who are going to be very engaged, but not able to see that there are racist issues that need to be addressed as part of the work that you're doing. So I'd love to hear you kind of talk about how you're going to approach that, or how you have approached that.
Well, so you guys interrupt me when you're, so right now we're finishing our last sort of project that we're putting together a website to try and talk about the work we did. And the very ending is about, so how do you get to action? And how do you get to people to commit, to maintain their promises to commitment? So while we went through a huge administrative process to get permission to go talk to principals, and then get principals to say okay, and then keep them engaged for a year long, which ended up turning into 2 years of work, and then getting to the end and finding out that really we hit very few home runs in the process of maintaining that engagement from day one until we were able to say, hey, this is what we have, now what do we do? And so, so I think that's part of the issue, especially with schools, because you have so many moving pieces and leadership changes. And then, so, as an old educator, many of us know that you need champions, and whether it's a reading champion or a math champion, somebody in that space has to believe, right? And has to look at the opportunities of how you bring this and keep it in the forefront so that people hear it, and then the politics. So schools, I think we picked up a bit of a challenge thinking, and that was my background. So I probably was taken aback a little bit that it's such a heavily political place that they are, so we did learn a lot, and we think, well, if we go forward, man, we'll pick a smaller space to try and push it through, as opposed to 10 different schools at one time. That I think that was one of our lessons that I learned. But commitment to time, I put down, people accepting that they need to be part of the work, that they need help getting there. The students and their parents both did this magnificent job, just to mention the actual participants who did the work. And one of our culminating pieces was that the PD that we developed 5 years ago, actually then the students were able to pick up and present to staff at one of the schools, because the leadership, the principal says, this is good stuff, I want, and the students presented to the teachers. And so, it's time, right? It's time. And schools these days, we were very honorable in terms of recognizing that, time is an issue within the schools to come in and do work like this. And we did it after school, we did it on Saturdays, and that kind of thing. So
I just wanted to add, because Karen, I hear two things in your question, and I want to pull those apart a little bit. So the first thing I hear is, if an intervention in particular has equity or anti-racist goals and leaders are not ready, right? So I think that's and I think for all of us, as we sort of think about intervention development, we do need some intel, right? Some background, some needs assessment, whatever you want to call it, right? On organizational, and particularly to the importance of leadership readiness, right? To engage with this work. Because if we imagine a stages of change model, right? You probably need different sorts of intervention components, depending on where both the individual and the organization is in their stages of anti-racist change. That's what I'll call it, right? And to Louise's point, you can't forget about the organization piece, because the individuals, can change, right? There's that dynamic that's happening. And then the second piece with CFR is sort of independent of intervention goals, right? Even if it's not obviously or explicitly anti-racist health equity, when we think about intervention success and sustainability and dissemination, how does race or racialized organizations, which we all participate in, how do those components affect that? And it could be from anything from who's participating, right, to how, to the extent that an intervention gets tailored, which ways it gets tailored, and how does, to whose needs, does that tailoring respond to? And so part of it is just sort of acknowledging that we are always in these racialized environments, so that these factors, regardless of intervention objective, are going to be present and relevant.
Any other questions? So I have a question then. If so, what's next? Are you going to take on other implementation frameworks? Are you looking at, so this, CFR is, it's not, I could imagine evaluation frameworks in implementation science that looking at, well, what's the outcome of this implementation, and who is it experiencing, different effects on the outcomes and so forth. Are you guys thinking of, this, do you look at this as also methods work in implementation science, or is this more project focused? Or I'm curious if you could share what's next with this whole, I think it's a really wonderful example of integrating race or health equity into an implementation science framework and doing it with community partners. And are you guys thinking of doing this in other areas within implementation science?
So so yes, in a broad sense. I'll tell you what I'm thinking about today, because we just received an NIMHD P50 and so we're going to be looking at the relationship, structural racism at multiple levels in relationship to multiple chronic diseases. And we're going to be looking across our 3 core research projects, as well as the pilot projects we're funding with this same framework. And so I think what we're hoping to understand is how, to kind of try to apply this approach across multiple projects, sort of refine it, see what we learn, and also we have a group of implementation scientists who are much more skilled. So I think that, there probably will be opportunities to see how critical race approach interacts with some other implementation science models.
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations on your.
So
Thank
is that one of the transformational awards, the transformational work in health equity?
It was the center grant, that the RFA that came out in, I don't know, April and was due, or May, and we had turned it around in about 2 months or something like that. So it's the chronic disease disparities grants, the P50 that NIMHD funded. So the 9 that have been just announced. Yeah.
Sounds like it will be very transformational. Really wonderful.
It's very exciting work. Yeah.
Becca has a question.
Yeah, hearing about this new grant. So one of the things that I was so excited about with your project is that you were using CFR in a school context and not in a clinical context. And that's where I like to use it too, but you start thinking about racism in different ways outside of medicine. And so I'm wondering, in your new grant, are you going to be looking at lots of different types of settings, or are they all school-based interventions? And anything else you might be able to share about kind of how you think maybe the setting might influence things?
Yeah, so it was, it's really, I'm sure you all are very familiar with all the challenges with trying to use CFR, and particularly kind of it, really sort of, so before this meeting, we were really trying to think about how do we intersect kind of our qualitative data with our relatively limited number of schools with our quantitative sort of outcomes. And so that's like, that kind of complexity, I think, is one of the things we're going to continue to try to talk about. So that's one area. The three main research projects, one of them is clinic-based, and then the other two are community-based, and they all have a participatory component. So that'll kind of give us some opportunity to look across different contexts. I think what I started with was really sort of thinking about, when we try to do these complex community-based interventions, how different that is than some of the sort of foundational work that CFR came out of, across the BAs and across, these, kind of context when you're comparing across multiple clinics, that you're able to push out an intervention and have lots of opportunity for comparison. So that's an area that, I really see the field as evolving and so we'll have a few more because we're combining data within, across 20 some, I think 30 pilots, as well as these three main research projects. So maybe that will give us some more kind of opportunity to create some standardization. And then there is a data coordinating center across all the sites. And I don't think we know enough about how much implementation science is part of the other centers' work, but it would be great if there could be some kind of community based project implementation analyses that might use some consistent approaches across all of these sites. I think that could be really interesting. We'll see.
Well, thank you guys so much for sharing your work, and it's just been really wonderful to hear about how you're really, it seems, leading in the area of especially having this racism conscious framework and doing real research, not not writing another conceptual paper or talking about it, but actually trying to apply it and disseminate your work, like in your publication, and doing so it talks like this. It's really helpful to those of us in the field of implementation science to hear about your work this way. And thank you, Louise, for jumping in, sharing your thoughts as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That was just absolutely perfect, and gives us a lot of things to think about, and really also models for us the importance of engaged work, which we all believe in very deeply. And it's not so easy to do. It takes a lot of time and energy, and we appreciate the investment you've made in that. So thanks, everybody. Great to see everyone. We will see you in a month, and we'll finish up our series on equity. And then in December, we'll be doing our grant reviews focused on projects that are going to be going in the winter time. So you'll be getting a little bit more detail on that in the next couple of weeks. So good to see everybody. Thanks so much. Great day.